The fluorescent lights of the high-security briefing room hummed with a clinical, predatory sharpness, mirroring the headache throbbed behind Captain Zeal Victor's eyes. She sat at the center of the room, anchored to a bolted steel chair, while three high-ranking officers loomed over her like vultures circling a fresh wreck. On the table between them lay the physical remains of her career, a shattered flight helmet and a digital tablet displaying the cold, unforgiving data of the crash log. "Captain Victor, let's look at the telemetry one more time," Colonel Vance said, his voice dripping with a practiced, condescending patience. He tapped the screen, and a 3D reconstruction of the mission flickered to life. According to the Aegis 9 radar system, the most advanced sensor array on the planet, the airspace over the Bering Strait was empty. There was no interceptor. There was no bogey. There was only you and Lieutenant Miller. Zeal looked at the screen, but she didn't see the green lines of the official report. She saw the fire. She saw the way the sky had seemed to tear open, a silhouette darker than the night itself appearing out of thin air. "The radar is wrong, sir," she said, her voice raspy from smoke inhalation but steady. "It didn't just appear, it was already there. It was masking its thermal signature by slaving its exhaust to our own. I called out the lock-on. Miller broke left, and the missile." "The missile that doesn't exist?" Vance interrupted, leaning in so close she could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "The flight recorder shows Miller's engine suffered a catastrophic compressor stall. It shows you pulling a 9G maneuver to avoid nothing. You panicked, Captain. You broke formation, you left your wingman exposed to a mechanical failure, and you watched him spiral into the ocean because you were chasing ghosts." "I wasn't chasing ghosts." Zeal's hand slammed against the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the stereo room. "I saw the kinetic impact. I saw the shrapnel shear off his vertical stabilizer. If the radar didn't see it, then the radar is compromised." A heavy silence followed. The officer to Vance's left, a woman with ice-gray hair and eyes to match, scribbled a single word on a legal pad: delusional. "Captain," the woman said softly, "we understand the trauma of losing a partner. But to suggest that a billion-dollar integrated defense network lied to cover up a phantom enemy is not only a reach, it's a symptom. You're describing a technology that violates the laws of physics." "I'm describing what I fought," Zeal countered, her gaze fixed downward at her hands. They were stained with soot that no amount of scrubbing could remove. Her flight suit was tattered, the fabric scorched from the fireball she had flown through to try and find Miller's parachute. A parachute that never opened. Vance stood up, sliding a heavy manila folder across the table. It was the formal recommendation for a dishonorable discharge and the immediate revocation of her flight status. "The board has reached a consensus. You are being grounded indefinitely, pending a full psychiatric evaluation and a court-martial for the loss of a multi-million-dollar airframe due to pilot negligence." He reached out, his fingers hovering near the blue and yellow flight badge pinned to her chest. "You were the best we had, Zeal. But the sky is for pilots, not poets who see monsters in the clouds. You're done." Zeal didn't flinch as he spoke. She felt a hollow, crushing weight settling into her chest. It was the sound of a door slamming shut on the only life she had ever known. She looked at the crash log one last time, the neat, clean lines of a lie that had been programmed into the world. She had saved the fleet from a predator they couldn't see, and in return, they were stripping her of her soul. As the guards moved in to escort her out, Zeal felt the first flicker of something dangerous. Not just grief, but the cold, hard certainty that the monsters were still out there, and now, no one was left to watch the skies. The heavy oak doors of the inquiry room swung open with a hollow thud, echoing through the marble corridor of the command center like a casket closing. Zeal stepped out into the hallway, her legs feeling like lead. She didn't look at the guards stationed at the entrance, nor did she look at the junior officers who quickly averted their eyes as she passed. The air in the base, once filled with the electric hum of purpose, now felt cold and stagnant. At the end of the hall, near the glass-walled atrium that overlooked the flight line, stood a small podium. Waiting there was a master sergeant with a face carved from granite. He didn't offer a salute. He didn't even offer a word. He simply held out a silver tray. Zeal stopped. Her breath hitched in her throat as she looked down at the olive-drab fabric of her flight suit. The scorched edges of the collar scraped against her neck, a physical reminder of the heat she'd endured to save a man the military now claimed she had murdered through incompetence. Slowly, her trembling fingers reached for the blue and yellow flight badge pinned over her heart. The metal was cold. With a sharp, agonizing rip, she tore the Velcro, backing away. The sound was small, but in the silence of the atrium, it felt like her own ribs were being snapped. She placed the wings on the tray. They looked small and insignificant sitting there, years of training, hundreds of combat hours, and the memory of every sunset she'd seen from 30,000 feet, all reduced to a piece of embroidered fabric. "Hand over your security clearance," the sergeant muttered, his voice devoid of emotion. She pulled the lanyard from her neck and dropped it beside the wings. She was no longer Captain Zeal Victor. She was no one. She turned toward the exit, her boots clicking rhythmically against the polished floor, a stark contrast to the distant, muffled roar of engines on the tarmac. She bypassed the locker rooms. There was nothing left there she wanted. She walked through the main lobby, past the oil paintings of legendary pilots, her head bowed. She felt the weight of every gaze, the silent judgment of an institution that valued the perfection of its machines over the testimony of its humans. Pushing through the heavy glass exit doors, she was met by a sudden, biting wind. The sky was the color of a bruised plum, the sun setting behind a thick layer of clouds that promised a storm. The airbase was vast, a city of concrete and steel, and for the first time in a decade, Zeal was on the outside. She began the long trek toward the main gate. The walk was nearly a mile, and she did it on foot, clutching nothing but the memory of Miller's voice over the comms. Every step was a struggle. The scorched fabric of her suit felt like a brand of shame, the tattered edges fluttering in the wind. A transport truck roared past, splashing a puddle of oily water over her boots, but she didn't flinch. She just kept walking. She reached the perimeter fence, the towering chain link topped with razor wire that marked the edge of her world. The gate guard, a young airman who had once asked for her autograph after her first solo mission, looked at her with a mix of pity and horror. He didn't ask for her ID, he simply hit the switch to retract the barrier. Then, she turned her back on the base and began to walk into the gathering dark, unaware that the world she had just been exiled from was about to come screaming after her. The cold rain began to fall in earnest, soaking through the tattered shoulders of Zeal's flight suit and weighing down her spirit with every step she took away from the gate. The world outside the wire was too quiet, too still. She felt like a phantom, a relic of a war that the world's censors had simply refused to acknowledge. Suddenly, the stillness was shattered by the rhythmic, heavy thud of high-performance engines. High-intensity strobe lights cut through the fog behind her, painting the wet pavement in flashes of strobing white and blue. A motorcade of black armored SUVs roared past her, then swerved violently, tires screaming as they banked across the road to block her path. Zeal stopped, squinting against the blinding glare of the lead vehicle's high beams. She expected security forces, perhaps the military police coming to finalize her disgrace. Instead, the rear door of the command SUV flung open before the vehicle had even fully stopped. Major General Mark Holloway scrambled out. This wasn't the composed, iron-jawed commander who had presided over her hearing. His tie was loosened, his face was ashen, and his eyes were wide with a frantic, haunted realization. He didn't wait for his security detail. He ran toward her, his polished shoes splashing through deep puddles, heedless of the rainwater ruining his formal service dress blues. 20 feet from her, the general's knees gave out. He hit the wet tarmac with a sickening thud, his hands shaking as he held up a glowing tactical tablet. "Captain? Zeal!" he choked out, his voice breaking over the sound of the falling rain. "Wait! Please, you have to look. You were right. God help us, you were right!" Zeal stood frozen, her arms wrapped around herself to keep from shivering. "It's over, General," she said, her voice hollow. "The radar doesn't lie. You said it yourself? I'm a ghost chaser. The radar lied to us." Holloway sobbed, thrusting the tablet toward her. "Look at the raw telemetry packets. We found a subterranean server, a ghost algorithm. It wasn't a malfunction, Zeal. It was an intercept. The software was programmed to identify the specific frequency of those bogies and scrub them from the visual interface in real time. It didn't just hide them, it replaced the space they occupied with a loop of empty sky." Zeal stepped forward, her curiosity overriding her exhaustion. She looked down at the tablet. On the screen, the official green radar skin was being overlaid with a pulsing red thermal bypass. There it was. The silhouette she had seen with her own eyes. The jagged, predatory shape that had murdered Miller was pulsing on the screen. It hadn't been a ghost. It had been a predator hiding in a digital blind spot created by their own command. The system was hacked from the inside, Holloway whispered, looking up at her from the ground. Tears mingled with the rain on his cheeks. "The same people who signed your discharge papers are the ones who installed the bypass. They use you as a scapegoat to hide an invasion that's already started. A second wave is pinging the coast right now, and the Aegis system is still seeing clear skies." He reached out, grasping the hem of her scorched flight suit. "Miller didn't die because of your negligence. He died because we were blind, and you were the only one with the courage to see. We need you, Zeal. The prototype, the X-97, it's the only bird with an analog targeting system that can't be spoofed by the hack. But no one else can fly it dark without the HUD. Only you." Zeal looked from the glowing red dots on the tablet to the man kneeling in the dirt. The crushing weight that had settled in her chest for days didn't disappear, but it shifted, hardening into a cold, sharp edge of fury. The system hadn't just failed her, it had betrayed the man she tried to save. "Get up, General," Zeal said, her voice regaining the steel that had earned her the call sign Zeal in the first place. She reached down, not to comfort him, but to take the tablet. "If we're going to save the fleet, we're wasting time in the mud." The black SUVs tore across the airfield, bypassing the main security checkpoints and heading straight for Hangar 7, the reinforced tomb of the X-97 prototype. The rain was a torrential curtain now, lashing against the windshield as General Holloway barked orders into an encrypted radio. Beside him, Zeal sat with the tactical tablet clamped in her hands, her eyes fixed on the hangar's looming silhouette. Her exhaustion had been replaced by a cold, vibrating clarity. She wasn't an outcast anymore. She was a hunter. The hangar staff should have the bird prepped for a diagnostic run, Holloway muttered, though his hand rested nervously on the holster at his hip. "But I haven't been able to reach the lead tech for 20 minutes. The motorcade screeched to a halt inside the cavernous mouth of the hangar. The air inside smelled of jet fuel, ozone, and something copper, something that didn't belong in a pristine maintenance bay. The X-97 sat in the center of the floor, a jagged, matte black shard of the future, its cockpit canopy open like a waiting mouth. Zeal leaped from the SUV before it fully settled. "Clear the floor!" Holloway shouted to the half-dozen technicians scattered around the jet's landing gear. The men in grease-stained jumpsuits didn't scramble to obey. They froze. One man, holding a pneumatic wrench near the jet's secondary intake, looked up. He didn't have the tired, grease-monkey eyes of a career mechanic. He had the dead, focused stare of a mercenary. "Captain, get back!" Holloway screamed, reaching for his sidearm. It happened in a blur of motion. The technician, by the intake, dropped his wrench and pulled a suppressed submachine gun from a tool chest. The first burst of fire shattered the SUV's windshield, showering the floor and safety glass. "Cover!" Zeal dived behind a heavy oxygen cart as the hangar erupted into a chaotic symphony of ricochets and shouted commands. Holloway's security detail returned fire, the booming cracks of their service pistols echoing off the high steel rafters. Zeal peeked around the cart, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw one of the assassins climbing a maintenance ladder toward the X-97's open cockpit, a small, silver device in his hand, a thermal charge. If he dropped that into the seat, the prototype's analog brain would melt, and the only weapon capable of seeing the ghost would be a pile of slag. She didn't have a gun. She didn't have armor. All she had was the tattered flight suit she had been shamed in, and a lifetime of knowing every inch of a hangar floor. She lunged from behind the cart, staying low as bullets sparked off the concrete behind her. She grabbed a heavy CO2 fire extinguisher from a wall rack and yanked the pin. As the assassin reached the top of the ladder, Zeal didn't try to climb after him. She aimed the nozzle at the base of the rolling stairs and unleashed a freezing, blinding cloud of white vapor. The assassin, blinded and losing his footing on the ice-slicked rungs, swayed. Zeal surged forward, slamming the heavy canister into the base of the ladder with everything she had. The structure groaned and tilted, sending the mercenary crashing 10 feet down onto the concrete. The silver charge skittered across the floor, landing harmlessly yards away. "Zeal! The ladder!" Holloway yelled, providing suppressive fire as he moved toward her. Another shooter emerged from beneath the jet's wing, leveling his weapon at Zeal's chest. Before he could pull the trigger, the general's lead security officer took him down with a double tap to the center mass. The hangar was a graveyard of smoke and spent brass. Holloway grabbed Zeal by the shoulder, his face splattered with oil. "They're already inside the wire. They knew we were coming." Zeal didn't look at the bodies. She looked at the ladder, then at the cockpit of the X-97. The black smoke from the distant crash site was visible through the hangar's open doors, a grim reminder of Miller. "They didn't just hack the radar, General," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, low vibrato. "They've occupied the base. If I don't get this bird in the air now, there won't be a base left to defend." She didn't wait for permission. She scrambled up the repositioned ladder, her boots treading over the scorched fabric of her suit as she dropped into the cockpit. The smell of the leather and the glow of the analog dials felt like coming home. She reached up, grabbing the handles of her flight helmet, the one they had tried to break, and pulled it on. "Clear the bay, General!" she commanded over the roar of the auxiliary power unit. "I'm taking the runway." The twin engines of the X-97 coughed, then roared into a primal, earth-shaking howl that vibrated through the hangar's steel skeleton. Inside the cockpit, Zeal snapped her harness buckles into place, her fingers moving with the muscle memory of a predator returning to the hunt. The analog dials on the dash flickered to life, needles dancing in amber light, blissfully free of the digital infection that had blinded the rest of the fleet. "General, the tower is locking down the mag locks on the hangar doors." Zeal's voice crackled through the comms, cold and sharp. "If those doors don't open in 30 seconds, I'm going to have to blow them, and I'd rather save my ordnance for the people who actually deserve it." Outside the jet, General Holloway stood his ground amidst the smoke of the skirmish, his radio held to his lips like a weapon. "Tower, this is General Holloway. Override the lockdown on Hangar 7. Clear the main runway for an immediate tactical departure. Call sign, Phoenix 1. A burst of static hissed in his ear, followed by the oily, calm voice of Air Marshal Sterling, the man who had led the inquiry against Zeal. "General, you are overstepping your authority. Captain Victor is a civilian under arrest. If that engine doesn't shut down immediately, security forces are authorized to use lethal force against the airframe. Step away from the jet, Mark. Don't throw your stars away for a delusional pilot." Holloway looked up at the cockpit, catching Zeal's eyes through the reinforced glass. He saw the same fire he had seen the day she graduated top of her class, a defiance born not of ego, but of truth. He turned his back to the hangar doors and looked at his lead security officer. "Point the SUVs at the doors. If they don't cycle, we ram the control sensors." "General." Sterling's voice returned, booming over the base's exterior loudspeakers. "You are relieved of command. All units, Hangar 7 is now a hostile zone. Fire at will." The base sirens began to wail, a mournful rise and fall that signaled an internal threat. Two armored Humvees rounded the corner of the taxiway, their roof-mounted 50s swiveling toward the open hangar mouth. "Zeal, they're closing in!" Holloway shouted over the roar. He didn't hesitate. He pulled his own sidearm and fired a single, symbolic shot into the air, then keyed the broad-spectrum channel. "To all personnel who still honor their oath. This is your general. The radar has been compromised by a foreign exploit. Captain Victor is the only pilot with a clean bird. If you want to save this base, you get her to the sky." For a heartbeat, the world hung in the balance. Then, the heavy steel hangar doors began to groan. They didn't retreat fully, but they shuddered and began to slide. A young technician, inspired by the general's stand, had smashed a manual override in the sub-basement. "Go!" Holloway screamed, gesturing wildly toward the widening gap. Zeal slammed the throttle forward. The X-97 lurched, its tires shrieking as it taxied out of the hangar at a dangerous, breakneck speed. Bullets from the approaching Humvees sparked off the jet's stealth coating, pinging like hailstones against the tin roof, but Zeal didn't flinch. She steered the black shard of a plane onto the taxiway, threading the needle between a line of parked fuel trucks and the advancing security teams. "Tower, I'm not asking for clearance," Zeal broadcasted, her voice cutting through Sterling's panicked commands. "I'm taking it. If you want to stop me, you better have something faster than a radio." She lined up on the center stripe of runway 39er. The rain was blurring the world into a gray smear, but the analog horizon on her dash was true. She pushed the afterburners to the stops. Two massive tongues of blue-white flame erupted from the rear of the jet, vaporizing the rainwater on the tarmac into a cloud of steam. The G-force slammed her back into the seat, a familiar, brutal embrace. The wings, tattered and scorched just like her suit, gripped the air. With a defiant roar that shook the windows of the command center, the X-97 broke contact with the earth. Zeal felt the landing gear retract with a mechanical thud, the heartbeat of a machine reborn. She was no longer a disgraced outcast walking the shoulder of a highway. She was a lightning bolt aimed at the heart of a lie. The sky above the coast was a chaotic swirl of purple thunderheads and biting rain, a jagged landscape of clouds that mirrored the turmoil below. As Zeal leveled the X-97 at 20,000 feet, the cockpit felt like a pressurized tomb. Her primary heads-up display was a ghost town of empty data. The high-altitude sensors, still slave to the compromised base network, showed nothing but a serene, vacant sky. To any other pilot, the world was empty. To the radar, the war wasn't happening. But Zeal wasn't looking at the digital display. She reached down and toggled a heavy, manual switch, cutting the feed to the main HUD entirely. The amber glow of the analog dials took over, flickering with the raw, unedited vibrations of the airframe. She adjusted her grip on the stick, feeling the minute shudders of the jet's skin. "Phoenix 1 to command." Zeal's voice was a whisper of steel. "I'm in the sector. I can't see them on the glass, but I can feel the wake turbulence. They're here." "Copy, Phoenix." General Holloway's voice crackled, distant and besieged by static. "The base defenses are still slave to the ghost algorithm. They think you're the only hostile in the air. If the automated batteries lock on, I can't stop them from the floor. You're flying blind, Zeal." Suddenly, the X-97 banked hard to the left without a command. A massive pressure wave slammed into the fuselage, the physical displacement of an object moving at Mach 1.5. Zeal's eyes darted to the side. For a split second, the rain beaded strangely in the empty air, outlining a sharp, predatory silhouette that existed only as a distortion in the mist. It was a ghost, the invisible invader. "Found you," she hissed. She slammed the throttle, the afterburners kicking her into the seat as she chased the distortion. Without a radar lock, she couldn't use her long-range missiles. She had to do this the old-fashioned way. She had to use her eyes, her instincts, and the sheer audacity that had once cost her her wings. The invisible enemy dove into a thick bank of clouds, trying to lose her in the gray soup. Zeal followed, her heart pounding in sync with the rhythmic beat of the engine. She watched the way the cloud vapor swirled, the vortex shedding, that no software could hide. It was a trail of breadcrumbs in a digital wilderness. The ghost pulled a high G-turn, and Zeal mimicked it, her vision tunneling as the force crushed the air from her lungs. She was flying by the seat of her pants, sensing the proximity of the enemy by the way her own jet fought the disturbed air. A warning chime suddenly screamed in her ear, not from the enemy, but from her own base. The Aegis system had finally tracked her. To the corrupt officers in the tower, she was the rogue element that needed to be erased. "Missile launch detected! Terminal phase!" Holloway yelled over the comms. "Zeal, break right! Our own SAMs are coming for you!" She didn't break right. She looked at the swirling mist ahead, where the ghost was beginning to level out. If she broke now, she was dead, and the enemy would remain a secret. "I'm not breaking," she whispered, her hands rock steady. She pushed the X-97 to its absolute limit, closing the gap until she was mere meters from the invisible tail of the invader. The base's surface-to-air missile, a streak of white fire, tore through the clouds behind her, locked onto her thermal signature. At the last possible microsecond, Zeal yanked the stick back into a brutal Cobra maneuver. The X-97 stood on its tail, air brakes screaming. The incoming base missile, unable to compensate for the sudden loss of speed, shot past her, and slammed directly into the invisible mass of the ghost. The sky erupted. A massive fireball bloomed in the clouds as the enemy's cloaking field collapsed under the kinetic impact. For the first time, the radar in the command center lit up with a massive, undeniable hostile signature. The lie was dead. "Splash one," Zeal gasped, her lungs burning. "Tell the general the ghosts can bleed." The fireball from Zeal's victory illuminated the tactical monitors in the command center, a blinding white blossom that briefly overrode the clear sky loop of the ghost algorithm. For 3 seconds, the truth was undeniable. A jagged, hostile signature had been erased from existence. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the screen flickered, the red pulse vanished, and the radar returned to its tranquil, fabricated lie. General Holloway spun away from the glass observation deck, his eyes blazing. "Did you see that? The kill was confirmed. The bypass is real." He turned to the room of officers, his hand hovering over the master override console. "I want every server in this building purged. Now! We take the entire grid to analog. I want to see what Captain Victor is seeing." "I'm afraid that's not possible, General," a voice said, slick and calm as polished marble. Holloway froze. Standing by the primary data uplink was Colonel Miller, his executive officer, his right hand, and the man who had personally prepared the falsified evidence for Zeal's court-martial. Miller wasn't looking at the screens. He was looking at Holloway, and in his hand was a suppressed submachine gun, pulled from a concealed compartment beneath the terminal. The air in the room turned to ice. Across the room, 2 junior technicians stood up, drawing sidearms from their waistbands. They weren't looking at the radar. They were looking at the general. "Sterling was just a loudmouth distraction, Mark," Miller said, his voice devoid of his usual military cadence. "He actually believed the radar. But you were always too sentimental. You just had to go and find her on that highway, didn't you?" "You," Holloway whispered, the word tasting like bile. "You're the one who installed the bypass. You let Miller die. You tried to bury Zeal alive. The algorithm is worth more than a few pilots, General. It's the future of warfare, total deniability. If the world doesn't see the invasion, it didn't happen. And once the secondary strike hits the capital, we'll be the ones holding the only working radar in the hemisphere." Miller raised the weapon, the muzzle a dark, empty eye. "Step away from the console. You're going to order Zeal to eject. Tell her it was a malfunction. Tell her to come home." Holloway looked at the screen where Zeal's transponder was alone, flickering light in a sea of manufactured darkness. He felt the weight of his stars, the weight of every lie he had almost let himself believe. He looked at Miller, and for the first time in 30 years, the general didn't follow the rules. "The only thing coming home today, Colonel, is the truth," Holloway said. In one fluid motion, Holloway didn't reach for his gun. He reached for the heavy brass award statue on his desk and hurled it at the overhead sprinkler sensor. As the metal struck the glass bulb, a deafening alarm joined the wail of the sirens, and a torrential downpour of fire-suppressant water crashed down on the electronics. The room erupted. Miller fired, the suppressed shots hissing through the spray, but Holloway had already dived behind the reinforced steel of the command dais. "Secure the room!" Miller screamed, his voice cracking as the salt-heavy water short-circuited the primary monitors, causing the ghost loops to glitch and tear. Holloway crawled through the rising water, his uniform soaked, his fingers fumbling for the emergency manual flare in his pocket. He didn't need to win a gunfight. He just had to keep the room in chaos long enough for Zeal to finish what she started. He keyed his wet radio, the signal barely pushing through the interference. "Zeal! The nest is compromised. The mole is in the room." Holloway roared into the mic as a bullet chipped the stone an inch from his head. "Don't look back. Use the analog feed. If they can't see the enemy, make them see the fire. Blow the clouds, Captain. Give them a signal we can't ignore." From the floor of the war room, amidst the sparks of dying computers and the hiss of gunfire, the general held the line. He was no longer a bureaucrat in a blue suit. He was a soldier in a trench, waiting for his angel to bring the thunder. The roar of the fire-suppressant system in the war room was a distant ghost compared to the screaming of Zeal's twin turbines as she climbed into the thin, frozen air of the stratosphere. The ghost she had downed was only the scout. Her analog sensors were now screaming with 3 more heat blooms. They were closing in on the coast, invisible to every satellite and SAM site in the country. "Nest is compromised," Zeal repeated, the general's frantic warning echoing in her headset. Her jaw tightened. If the command center was under siege, there was no one left to verify her kills. She was still a criminal in the eyes of the grid. "If they can't see the enemy," she whispered, mimicking Holloway's words, "I'll make them see the fire." She looked at her fuel gauge. She was running low. She had one chance to strip the mask off the invasion and her own reputation simultaneously. Zeal slammed the stick forward, putting the X-97 into a vertical power dive. The G-force clawed at her skin, trying to peel her soul from her body. She wasn't aiming for the enemy jets, she was aiming for the sonic ceiling. Below her, the second wave of invisible hostiles was skimming the heavy cloud layer at Mach 1.2, confident in their digital shroud. "Phoenix 1, what are you doing?" A panicked voice from the secondary tower cut through. "You're heading for a structural overstress. Level off." Zeal ignored them. She watched the altimeter spin downward. 30,000 feet, 2015. She was a black needle piercing the sky. As she neared the enemy formation, she didn't fire a missile. Instead, she pushed the throttles past the safety gates into the emergency overboost. The X-97 hit the sound barrier, but she didn't stop there. She pushed into Mach 2, then 2.5, creating a massive, localized pressure wave. As she tore through the enemy's flight path, she performed a violent, shimmering snap roll directly above them. The physics were undeniable. The massive sonic boom she created didn't just rattle windows on the ground. The sheer atmospheric displacement forced the moisture in the air to condense instantly. For a split second, a massive, white vapor cone erupted around the invisible jets. It was a physical shroud of white mist clinging to the jagged shapes of the invaders, outlining them in the sky like ghosts caught in a bedsheet. "There you are," Zeal growled. She toggled her broad-spectrum transponder to emergency broadcast and slaved her high-resolution gun camera to every civilian and military frequency within 1,000 miles. She wasn't sending data to the compromised radar. She was sending a live video feed to every news station, every cockpit, and every smartphone in the region. On millions of screens, the world saw it. Captain Zeal Victor, in her scorched, wingless flight suit, dogfighting 3 terrifying, black-winged invaders that the official radar claimed didn't exist. She stayed in the pocket, weaving through the vapor trails she had created, forcing the enemies to stay visible against the white mist. One of the hostiles tried to break away, but Zeal was already on his 6. Without a computer lock, she used the fixed crosshairs on her glass canopy, the old-fashioned way. She lead the shot, adjusted for the wind, and squeezed the trigger. The 20mm cannon fire traced a line of light through the air, stitching across the enemy's wing route. The invader disintegrated in a spectacular violet explosion. "Command, do you see them now?" Zeal shouted into the open channel. In the war room, the water-soaked monitors that had been looping empty sky suddenly flickered and died, replaced by the raw, undeniable video feed from Zeal's jet. The junior officers froze, their guns wavering as they saw the truth on the emergency screens. Colonel Miller stared at the monitor, his face pale as he watched his deniable invasion become the most watched event in history. Zeal pulled the X-97 into a victory roll, the vapor cone still trailing behind her like a champion's cape. She had broken the sound barrier, but she had shattered the lie. The radar could no longer hide the truth, and the world finally knew the name of the pilot they had tried to bury. The storm that had battered the coast for days finally broke, leaving the morning sky a vast, scrubbed canvas of crystalline blue. On the main tarmac of the airbase, the atmosphere was no longer heavy with the stench of oil and betrayal, but with the crisp, electric hum of a new era. A full-dress formation of airmen stood in silent, rigid rows, their eyes fixed on the makeshift stage erected in front of the charred but standing Hangar 7. General Mark Holloway stood at the podium, his uniform pressed and his posture reclaimed. A bandage was hidden beneath his collar from the war room skirmish, but his voice was steady as it boomed across the speakers. Behind him, a row of empty chairs marked the places where Marshal Sterling and Colonel Miller should have sat. Instead, they were currently being processed in a windowless brig, facing charges of high treason and secondary-degree murder. The ghost algorithm had been dismantled, its codes stripped bare to reveal a web of corruption that reached far beyond the base's gates. "We almost lost our way," Holloway declared, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "We trusted our screens more than our souls. We traded the intuition of our warriors for the comfort of a lie. But one pilot refused to accept the darkness." He turned, gesturing toward the edge of the stage. Zeal stepped forward. She was no longer wearing the scorched, tattered flight suit that had been her shroud of shame. She was dressed in a pristine, midnight blue service uniform. Her hair was pulled back in a sharp, disciplined knot, and though her face still bore the faint yellowing bruises of the hygiene maneuvers she had pulled to save them all, her gaze was no longer fixed on the ground. She looked at the horizon as if she owned it. Holloway reached into a velvet-lined box and pulled out a new set of wings. They weren't the standard-issue silver. They were crafted from a darkened, matte black titanium, shimmering with an iridescent edge that mirrored the skin of the X-97. "Captain Zeal Victor," the general said, his voice dropping to a tone of profound respect. "For valor above and beyond the call of duty, for seeing what we were too blind to acknowledge, and for defending this nation when its own censors turned against it, you are hereby promoted to the rank of Major." He pinned the black wings over her heart. The crowd erupted, a thunderous roar of applause that drowned out even the distant whine of a taxiing jet. But Holloway wasn't finished. He handed her a folder embossed with a gold seal. She thought of Miller, whose name had been cleared and whose memory would now be honored with a plaque on the very hangar that had nearly been his tomb.